Buongiorno. Grazie. Thank you so much for the lovely introduction. It's an honor to be here with the World Business Forum. It's an honor to be in Milan. I want to thank you for taking me out of my country for the election day because it's really stressful, and I'm really glad to be here. I did vote before I came, but it's actually good to be away from there. It's a very tense time in the US. We'll find out a lot when I wake up tomorrow here. We'll find out what happened in the US. I think you heard a lot from the Prime Minister of the importance of this election. So what I want to talk to you about today, I think my job today is to talk about this very deep change in what it means to be a business, what's expected of business, the role of business in society, and its role in helping solve our biggest problems. We are seeing enormous change right now in how we live our lives, the technologies we use, and what a business even means today. But before I get to that, when we talk about what's called sustainability, or often now ESG in business, it's easy to get lost in the details, to talk about your carbon footprint or your supply chain and start digging into the specifics. But before we do that, I want to set the stage a little bit. Now, anybody here know this city? It's a US city, and it's a little bit of a trick question because normally you can't see it. It's normally behind a lot of smog and dirt. This is Los Angeles, which most people don't realize actually has mountains nearby, has a similar background to here in many ways. And the reason I show this is because there was a day, not long ago, when it was the cleanest day probably in the history of the city. You probably know what this is, New Delhi, same day. And can anyone tell me what this city is? Please tell me you can tell me what city this is. This, I've been told, is Milan. And I've been using this picture all over the world. It's not just because I'm here. So you can probably guess, when was this? What was the cleanest day in all these cities? There were pictures around the world of Beijing, Sao Paulo, everywhere. This was second week of April 2020. The world had stopped. Now, I'm not suggesting that the way we get to a clean world is by shutting down the global economy. But this gave us a vision, because I think in the sustainability world or in the climate change discussion, it's so easy to talk about the doom and gloom and talk about the fact that 99% of people living in cities are breathing polluted air. We can get lost. This gave us a vision of what was possible. This is what the world looks like if we're powering everything with clean energy, if we're driving electric vehicles. And now imagine that these cities have a living wage for everyone. The communities that support the cities, the farms and rural areas, everyone has a living wage. They make enough. They have enough for everyone. That's the world we're trying to build. When I talk about sustainability in business, it's about creating a thriving world that is healthy and works for everyone. Now, we live in unbelievably volatile times. I've seen more change in what it means to be a business in the last 2 or 3 years than in the 20 that I've been doing this work. I want to take you back a few years. There was a moment, and it came out of the US, but it had kind of a global impact. There's a group called the Business Forum, and they are a group of CEOs of the 200 largest companies operating in the US. And they came out with a statement, the Business Roundtable. They came out with a statement about the meaning of business, the purpose. They said for years, for decades, we've been focused on shareholder value. If I asked you all, what's the purpose of business? What have we been taught for 50 years? It's that we should maximize profits above all. And maximize not just profits, but shareholder profits, and just for the short run. And all these companies said as one voice, you know, we actually do have stakeholders, and we've always created value for them, our customers, our employees, our communities, our suppliers. And so we are creating value for more than just shareholders. Now, I work with a lot of these companies. I don't think they changed immediately because of this statement, but I am a writer, and I think that words matter, and rhetoric matters. And this really kicked off a more global discussion about stakeholder capitalism versus shareholder capitalism. And actually, these CEOs were lagging. They were kind of behind the conversation. The Financial Times, which I think we can agree is a pro-market, pro-economic growth newspaper, had already launched a website about capitalism and how we need a reset. The Economist was writing about this. There was all this discussion about changing capitalism, changing the way businesses work. And then the pandemic hit, and companies were tested. And I think most did extremely well. We saw companies share technologies. A medical device maker, Medtronic, opened up the patents and shared the design of a ventilator so the big auto companies around the world could make more ventilators. We didn't have enough. There was this kind of work going on that was not just about how do I make money right now, it was this larger question. And what's happened in recent months and recent years is that companies are now being asked globally to take a stand, to have a position on a range of social issues, on climate and inequality, on LGBTQ plus rights, on racial equity, now on democracy itself, to have a position about whether the voting is protected in my country and in many others, to have a position on science, on misinformation, truth. Companies have to come out with these statements now. And it shows their values to the people that care about how they act, in particular their own employees. And you demonstrate these values in the way you think about your business in your everyday decisions. This is what a conversation like today is about. How do you run a business better and differently? And you have to show in your everyday consistency as a manager, as an executive, that you're living these values. And I will say that the data shows clearly. There's global surveys of consumers, of citizens by Edelman, the PR firm. They've done global surveys and asked people if a company has a stand on race or LGBTQ or climate, does it make you more likely to want to buy from that company? And surveys are not perfect, but they show that they're a lot more likely, 3, 4, 5 times more likely. People care. They want this. And this idea that companies have to speak is now demanded by almost everyone globally. They want CEOs to say something, to take a stand. And the big change in the last few years that was kind of the final straw, the big change in what made sustainability core to business, was the investment community. I've been watching this field for 20 years. Investors have not really been at the table. They haven't cared very much. But that changed. It started to change for many reasons. Larry Fink is the world's largest investor. He runs BlackRock. He had about 10 trillion under management a year ago. Now he has about 8 trillion under management. It's less, but it's still the most in the world. And he's been writing a letter to the world's CEOs every January for years. And the last 6 or 7 years have been about sustainability, ESG, and climate in particular. And he took on this idea that somehow this was anti-business. He said, this is how you create value. By creating value for your stakeholders, this is how you create long-term value for shareholders. This is capitalism. It's just a better form. So I'm going to repeat this statement because I get asked all the time, how can we do sustainability? Because it always costs more. And I just want to point out repeatedly all the different ways that it pays, that this is a better way of doing business. It pays to please your investors. And he is saying that it pays to do this as your mode of business. And now we're in this time of acceleration, and not just the growth of our problems and opportunities, but exponential growth. We have seen exponential change over the last century in the number of us. We are about to be 8 billion humans. The UN will declare a baby somewhere, the 8 billionth human, pretty soon. I'm old enough to remember when there was 5 billion people, when we hit that number when I was in elementary school. My father remembers 2 or 3 billion. We've seen exponential growth in all of the use of materials, energy use, water use, waste, and it's driven deep, deep change. And so we're in this time now of volatility, of uncertainty, a very complex time. And so there's 2 or 3 mega challenges that are driving the most change. First, there's this level of income and wealth inequality that's only gotten much worse. There's always been rich and poor. No one is saying that everyone should have the same. Capitalism does that. But in the last 40 to 50 years, in the Western world, all of the income and wealth gains have gone to the very top. To not just the 10%. You can see here today, the 10% globally have half the income and 3/4 of the wealth. But not just to the 10%, but to the 1%. 1% of the people have 37% of the wealth. And not just the 1, but the 0.1%. And actually, a lot of the wealth has gone to the 3 or 4 guys who make their own spaceships and go out into space. The wealth has run up to the point where the world's richest man can buy a social media company for fun. I don't think he's having much fun right now with Twitter, but he just threw $44 billion at it. The level of wealth inequality has gotten drastically worse. And the problem is not that there's rich people. Of course there are. The problem is that it used to be, 40 or 50 years ago, that everybody got wealthier. Everybody gained. The middle class had higher wages. There were fewer people in poverty. And that has disconnected. And this creates enormous tension on the world. And people who feel like they're left behind, they will vote for someone who stands up and says, I can fix it for you. I'm the one who will take care of you. And it happens in many countries, as we know. Most of the time, that person does not care about fixing it for you, but they're happy to get your vote. And we will find out in the US what kind of people we want to lead our country. Second, there's the climate challenge, which is an understatement. This is the existential threat of our times. I think of this as the final exam for humanity. We either solve this or all of our other problems are really moot. They don't matter. It's existential. It is about humanity's thriving. But if you want to put it in financial terms, there are numbers now that we've seen, estimates on the cost of this. So Swiss Re, the reinsurance companies in the world, are seeing the expense of extreme weather. Swiss Re has said that if we don't manage carbon aggressively over the next generation, we'll lose 18-20% of GDP. That's a lot, but it sounds livable, right? We've had great recessions. We've had slowdowns. It sounds livable, but I remind people that that's an average. You know, the Prime Minister said something interesting before about how the war right now, there's no winners. There's only losers. That's true with climate change. There really aren't winners. There's a few, very high latitude areas, maybe northern Canada, maybe parts of Russia, that will be warmer and can grow more crops. Their GDP might go up a little. But basically, this is a loss for everyone. And this 18% is an average. In many places, it's not 18% loss, but 100%. We are heading very quickly towards a world where large parts of the coasts are underwater or too hot to live, and there's going to be 1 billion or more refugees. This is where we're headed very quickly. But again, even if you want to put it in financial terms just for a given company, almost every large company says they've already felt real cost, real supply chain problems. And so we've hit this really important point in recent years. I hear all the time, people will say, especially kind of politicians will say, we can't tackle climate change. It will destroy the economy. But increasingly, that is just ludicrous. That is crazy. The cost of doing nothing is immense and existential. But it's not just that. It's not just that these incredible storms that are burning huge parts of the US, Australia, other places, these floods, 1/3 of Pakistan was underwater recently. It's not just that the cost is rising. The good news is that the cost of doing something has dropped. So if I stopped here and left, this would be the most depressing talk of the day. This is the down stuff. But the exponential trends that we've seen are also causing some good news. There's an exponential growth in the buying of renewable power. This is just corporate buying, even through the pandemic. This is an exponential curve. We're up at 30 gigawatts a year last year. That's a lot. That's like 30 nuclear plants. And this is companies, not utilities. This is companies buying for themselves, putting renewables, solar and wind, on the grid. And why is that happening? It's not because of ESG pressure or that they want to make a statement. It's because it's gotten cheaper. This is data from the bank Lazard. Every year they build models of what it costs to build energy of different sources. Wind and solar are now, on average around the world, cheaper than any other form of energy. They are cheaper. I keep hearing they're not. I don't know how many ways to say it. And in fact, in many parts of the world, it's now cheaper to build wind and solar than to operate an existing coal plant. The marginal cost of coal is higher than the cost of building the new renewables. Now, everything this year, the cost, I think when this new chart comes out within a couple weeks, very soon, everything will tick up because of supply chain issues, inflation. But they're still cheaper than the others. This is the cheapest form of energy. So again, sustainability pays. Going to renewables pays. It is a cheaper, easier form of business. And I want to show you the scale of what's happening, because people don't quite realize how fast this is happening. This is wind and solar. This is new data from Bloomberg. Wind and solar, this is an exponential curve. This is exactly what exponential looks like. And this is the additions of other sources of energy. So every year, the green bars are the addition of that source of energy. So you can see coal all over the place, right? Huge increases. Some of that's because of the pandemic, some of it's because of the war, but up and down. But fundamentally, it's not going to be growing. Natural gas had its huge peak as fracking became a viable technology. But I want to point out that we now are at the point where the amount we add of wind and solar is more than any single year of additions in natural gas, even during the global fracking boom. This is the most additions of any source of energy, wind and solar. So it's growing faster than anything has. And this is your data. This is just wind energy as part of your electricity, 7%. The data on solar is very similar. This is some of your neighbors. You're doing well, but not as fast as others. This is the percentage of just wind in places like Spain and Germany, Greece, Netherlands, Croatia, all growing very, very quickly. And if you take the clean, the pure clean, which is basically wind and solar and geothermal, and add hydro, you're now up at not just of your electricity, but 12% of all of your energy. All primary energy is renewables. That's up from 2% 15 years ago. So there was another article in Bloomberg recently that said technologies have natural tipping points, right? When a certain percentage of people are adopting it, when it hits a certain market share, 5 to 10% is often what you need before things really speed up. And they said that 87 countries now have hit that tipping point on renewables and on electric or electric vehicles. So it's only going in one direction. BP does their annual study of energy, of the world of energy, and they said that in the last 2 years, in effect, all of the new addition to the grid is wind and solar. China and other places are building coal plants, but they're also shutting some down. So the net effect is only renewables is being added. So this battle is over. We're heading towards all renewables. And so I know that we're entering a winter that is a little scary for Europe, for all of us. You don't want to buy natural gas from Russia, understandably. So there's concerns about energy. And I will say that the companies and countries that have gotten ahead of this have less concern. The CEO of Novozymes, which is, I think, one of the more sustainability-focused companies in Europe, told the Financial Times recently that because they are basically 100% powered by renewables, the natural gas prices aren't affecting them. It affects their whole business, their supply chain, sure, but their energy costs, not affected. So this is resilient, right? This gives you strength in your business the more you have renewables. And I think we're seeing now an acceleration in countries and companies to get as fast as they can off of the fossil fuels. There's some immediate needs, right? There's deals being made for liquid natural gas. There's immediate needs to avoid Russian fuel. But you're seeing more and more commitment to move to the new technologies. So we're also seeing exponential growth in vehicles. An amazing change in the amount of hybrid and electric cars. And again, it's because they're getting cheaper. The storage is exponentially cheaper. And so you're seeing now commitments across the world. And this was, to me, a really interesting moment. A few years ago, Daimler said, we are no longer funding internal combustion engine research. I don't know any better indication that a technology is done than you stop investing in it. You're no longer investing in making it better. And then they accelerated their timetable. They wanted to get out of it even faster. And so you have these vast commitments. GM, $6 billion, VW, 30, 40 billion, all to this move. And you have every major auto company has committed to only electric vehicles within the next 10, 15, 20 years. And more of the world is outlawing combustion engines. Norway has done this, the UK is heading there, California, which is basically its own country within the US, has its own rules, also banning the sale of internal combustion engines. The change is coming. And so we're seeing multi-trillion-dollar opportunities as we're changing the way we build buildings, ones that generate more energy than they use. We're changing the way we get around, the way we manufacture, and the food and agriculture system under enormous change. Consumer products, all changing. These are multi-trillion-dollar opportunities. So again, sustainability pays. This is growth. So the pressure to move in this direction is coming from all over. There's very key stakeholders, and in particular, business is pressuring itself in really interesting and evolved ways. It's gotten pretty intelligent, I think, and focused. So for example, Salesforce launched a program last year for suppliers, and they said, this is not a contract, but it looks exactly like a contract. I've never seen anything that looks more like a contract. And they said, if you don't hit certain climate targets, if you're not reducing your carbon footprint fast enough, you will be in breach. Now, breach is a word that's only used in contracts. So call it what you want. They said, you will be in breach, and we will charge you more. We won't pay you as much. And they take that penalty money, and they plug it into more renewables and ways to reduce the footprint. That's kind of the penalty approach. I think it's more exciting to see how companies are encouraging each other. So Tesco, the European retailer, and the Bank Santander have partnered to give the suppliers of Tesco, the suppliers that hit ESG targets, Santander's giving them lower cost of capital. It's giving them better financing. They're just getting a financial advantage if they're doing better on sustainability. And then there's not just carrots and sticks or punishments and rewards. There's just saying this is how you have to do business. As companies will say, you just have to use renewables. You have to set a carbon goal. It's just the way it is. And again, sustainability pays if you can answer your customers, if you're ready with the story. Because this is, in essence, every brand, every product is a story. And increasingly, people want to know the story of that product. Now, of course, investors, again, are coming to the table, and they're not just asking questions, they're putting real money into this world. These banks have put in trillions of dollars. This is actual capital going into what they're calling their sustainability efforts. About half of it is going to renewables and clean economy, and half to social issues, affordable housing, racial equity. Now, I worked with Bank of America back in, I think, 2008, and it was really one of the first times a bank was saying, we're going to put money towards sustainability. And they were debating whether they could commit as much as $25 billion. And now they're up to $1.5 trillion and growing. These are real numbers. And PwC says that over half of all the investable assets will be in some form of sustainable or ESG investing very soon, within a few years. And we're in this time now of these rising acronyms. There's the International Sustainability Standards Board that's based here in Europe. There's increasing goals from Europe, from the US. There's more and more requirements. So companies now face increasing expectations of measuring and assessing their materiality, of understanding their ESG, of reporting, of transparency. I see people taking pictures. I'll just tell you at the end, I'll have my website up, and you can go there and contact my staff and get a PDF of the slides if you like. But go ahead, take pictures. Also, I'll be talking about my book later. You'll see pictures from that. The book's really cheap, and actually it's on sale later. So you can do that too. But pictures are free. Now, this transparency, I think there's really two megatrends. The ones, when I get asked all the time, is this temporary? I just did an interview with Wall Street Italia earlier, and they asked, well, of course, with the war, with the recession and everything, are companies and countries still going to care about this? And I would say that in the 20 years I've been in this, every time there's been a recession or a big change in some way, sustainability has taken a back seat. People get fired in companies. But the pandemic, it was the opposite. It accelerated. The percentage of companies committed to big carbon reduction goals went up. And there's two fundamental changes that I think make this permanent. One is that we now have a increased level of transparency. It's data-driven, it's technology-enabled, but it's also increasingly regulatory. So not just the European world, the European regulatory world, but the SEC in the US, the Securities Exchange Commission, has said that they are going to require companies to measure and report their Scope 1 and 2 emissions. Now, for those who don't know, this is the terminology companies use. Scope 1 carbon emissions means the emissions that you generate on site. If you have a boiler, if you're burning coal or natural gas. Scope 2 is the emissions from the grid, the electric grid that you plug into. And I'll come back later what Scope 3 is. They're going to ask and demand that companies measure and report. That's transparency. You're also seeing, to me, the number one reason, just generational change. Because all change in the world that's permanent is because the norms change, the values change. And there is a fundamental difference now by generations. Now, I've been talking about this generational change, writing about it for 15 years, and I've talked about millennials as young. How many people are 40 and under here? Less than 40. Yeah, usually you put them in one little group. Okay. We've got a group of young people. Now, I speak mostly to executive teams or the top few hundred people in a company, and the millennials aren't quite there yet. Mostly it's 40s and 50s. The millennials and the Gen Z, I have two teenage boys. Now, as a Gen X, I will say that the millennials kind of annoy me. They kind of annoy Gen X, but that's okay. The boomers didn't like us. The war generation didn't like the boomers. I think Socrates found Plato annoying. It goes way back. It's always this way. But there is a difference in these two youngest generations. Their view of business is different, measurably different. Millennials for years, global surveys have said they care about values. They choose work in part on values. And Gen Z, represented maybe most by Swedish activist Greta Thunberg, but an entire generation, doesn't see a disconnect between society, environment, profit. They think this should all be one conversation, and they're right. They're also angry, as they should be. We're handing them a pretty bad situation, but they're also mobilized. They can mobilize so quickly. Greta was a kid with a sign, and within a year, there were millions of people in the streets following her. She was Time Magazine's Person of the Year, all through social media. This is the good side of social media. There's plenty that's wrong, but they can mobilize. And when I talk to executives about sustainability, one of the main reasons they find it so compelling, or they have to, is this. Not just their consumers and employees, but they're generally being asked by their own children, what are you doing? What's your legacy? So what kind of companies are going to be able to attract and retain talent? We're in a world right now where there's not enough people for most jobs. So the companies that can share their mission, that show that they believe in what they're doing, are going to attract the most people. So again, it pays to get the best people, to get the most innovative, excited, engaged people. Study after study shows engaged people produce much more value for business. Okay, so what does this all mean? Well, given the scale of the problems we face, it's not enough anymore to just be less bad. Most of the discussion in this arena has been we should cut emissions a little bit, we should look at our supply chain and try to reduce the number of human rights issues, and it's all kind of incremental. And incremental change can take you places, but we have to go much faster now. We're really out of time, and we need business to step up. Not lead, not be the only thing. I think it's naive to say that free markets and business will solve everything. That just is not possible. It's also naive, I think, when NGOs and others say, well, business is always a problem and government has to solve everything. It has to be both. It has to be government, business, and us, civil society. But business has to step up and acknowledge its role. And so it was this need, this urgency that led me to write this book, which I co-authored with Paul Pullman. He was the CEO of Unilever for 10 years. And Unilever has been ranked repeatedly in surveys of sustainable companies as number one for 12, 13 straight years. And for good reason. They're not perfect. There's plenty of things they've done wrong. They have lots of problems still to work through, but he made sustainability core to the company back in 2009, 2010, and he was CEO for a decade. And we came together to write this book because this is what I've been doing for 20 years, and he wanted to tell the story of Unilever in part, but connect it to everything that's going on in business. We define a net positive company as one that profits, so we say it is profit. Paul was the CEO of a public company. He was the CFO of Nestle before that. He cares about profit. Okay? Profit's fine. But the profit should come from solving the world's problems, not making them worse, not creating them. And the fundamental question we ask is the world better off because your business is in it? I find that people stop and think about that for a minute. And I will tell you, as someone, I hit 50 during the pandemic. In the first few weeks of the pandemic, I turned 50. We had a whole party planned. It turned into a Zoom meeting, which was kind of a bummer. But I found myself thinking, as many of you probably do in middle age, is the world better off because I'm in it? You know, I've created 2 boys. I think they're pretty great. What are they going to do for the world? What do they care about? These are important questions, I think, especially in these times. And we describe in this book the principles of a business that's not just good, not just improving things, but is really working to be net positive. And the core of it is ownership. Not corporate responsibility, but responsibility in the way that we mean it when we teach our kids. You break it, you own it. You cause a problem, you should solve it. And I'll come back to that in a second. The core of this model is long-term focus that serves multiple stakeholders. Now, what did Paul do at Unilever to create long-term focus? 3 weeks into the job, when he was CEO, he stopped reporting quarterly earnings. He told investors, I'm not going to talk to you quarterly. We're going to put our annual numbers out. And a bunch of investors were upset, and they walked out, and then they came back quickly. And it freed up the organization, the middle management, the people to think a little bit longer, to say this year we're going to focus on efficiency, maybe this year we're going to focus on brand building, and to have a longer view and to invest for the future. Because the short-term shareholder pressure that we've defined as the goal of business for 50 years has really driven us to make not very smart decisions. Research and development around the world has dropped because that's long-term. It's driven this very short-term focus. So pleasing stakeholders is how you generate value. And we said very specifically that one of the principles of a net positive business is shareholder return. But it's because of what you've done to solve a problem for somebody. That's what a business is. It fills some need. And then you need to believe fundamentally in the transformative role of really partnering and collaborating, because the problems we face are very big. Now, there's a lot of data out there I could share with you, a bunch of organizations that have taken a look, including McKinsey and others, that they've looked at companies that take a long-term view. And there's ways of measuring that. And those companies generally outperform. Now, again, I get the question all the time, does sustainability outperform? It's a weird question because we don't really ask that of almost any other strategy. We don't say, does R&D outperform? Does someone who's a tech-focused company, do they outperform? The companies that do it well do. The companies that do sustainability well, the ones that take the long-term focus and work on their most material issues, they do outperform. So let me talk about this ownership idea. And I mentioned before Scope 1 and 2 emissions, on-site emissions, electricity. Scope 3 is the emissions from your supply chain and your customers. This is the big deal. Companies are concerned about this because more and more regulation is coming, demanding information. And this is a chart that's also in the book, so people know. But we realized, and we saw other people talking about this, and we kind of built on this idea that there's more than just these 3 levels of impact. You could call it impact level 4, the sector. How does your sector interact with the world? And this is how you get to discussions of these regenerative or circular business models, these changes in how the whole sector works. 5th is policy. This is something I spend a lot of time on now and write about a lot. The question is whether a company is aligning its policy positions and the influence it has over government with its stated goals. And there's a huge disconnect. Companies have enormous carbon reduction goals. And then a bill comes up in my country at the state level, at the national level, that will invest in the clean economy, that will help us get to those goals, and they will try to stop it because they don't like some tax provision. There's not a connection between the policy positions, and I think increasingly this is hard to do. There's more transparency. So we're going to see more companies try to align their policy with their big goals. And then at the largest level, let's say you're a consumer products company, you have a role in consumption, in the consumption that's driving us kind of off this cliff. And how do we disconnect the quality of life from the amount of stuff we use? And whether we're still a fossil fuel-based society. These are kind of the biggest questions. You can do this not just for carbon or footprint on a physical level, but on people issues, the other side of ESG. So let's say you're a food and ag company and you care about employee safety. That's a huge kind of level 1 goal. Beyond that is the well-being of your people, their purpose. Are they bringing themselves to work? And then you could look back at your supply chain. If you have a food product, how are the farmers doing? Are they safe? Are there child laborers? Are the communities thriving? And again, policy. There's a big topic in agriculture, regenerative agriculture, a way to sequester carbon, where ranching and growing food could be a solution to the climate problem. But are you supporting the policies for that? Are you supporting policies that improve nutrition, that reduce food waste? And at the largest level, hunger. How do we stop hunger? When we get to 9 or 10 billion people, how do we feed them within the world's thresholds? Now, I know there's companies of all sizes in the room, and this could sound daunting. How can we solve hunger? But let me tell you, no matter how big the company, no company can solve this kind of problem alone. So the question is not, how do you solve hunger? It's, what problems can you help the world solve? Who can you come together with and be part of the solution? We also need, I think, a different kind of leadership. I'm sure you're going to hear in a lot of the talks today and tomorrow about being a leader. I think you're going to hear later about kind of love in business from Marcus Buckingham, which is interesting because we talk about love in this book, and a lot of people have said to me, you don't see that in business very much, that we talk about love and passion. We need a different kind of leader now. And one of the leaders we admire is Ajay Banga, who was the chairman and CEO of MasterCard. And he has talked about something he calls DQ, so not intelligence quotient or IQ or emotional intelligence, EQ, but DQ, decency. Do you care? Do you care about the people that work for you, that you work with, that you offer products to? So in the book, when we lay out the principles and then we start, really the whole book is about how do you build a company like this. The first chapter on that is called How Much Do You Care? Do you care that these problems exist? Do you care about what's happening to the climate? And you need, I think, a different set of leadership skills. Courage is really number one. The courage to lead from your own purpose and your sense of duty, to have that be part of your business. The courage to show humility, empathy. I think the biggest problem we face in society right now is a lack of empathy. The reason we're so divided is we don't seem to be able to understand other people's problems or feel for them. In some sense, for a lot of people, they don't seem to be able to feel it until it happens to them, which is the definition of empathy, that you feel it before it happens to you. And we need humility, because it takes humility to say to the world, we have really big problems, we don't know how to solve them, we want to invite in partners, because you need to work with others, and that includes critics. Maybe NGOs or others that aren't always happy with what the company's doing, but they may know something that's worth bringing in. And I believe everyone can be a leader. I wrote this with a CEO, but it's really for everyone. There are leaders within companies at all levels of all sizes. We all are leaders in different ways. And we can do this from many places in the organization. And Paul and I have a new article coming out soon on leading from the middle out, which is really mostly where change happens. The CEO can say, go do this, but it's the middle management, and that can be pretty senior, someone running a brand or a factory, a big part of the business. That's where the work happens. And so you need leadership from those places. So let me give you a little bit of a view on how do you build this kind of company. I can't summarize it all, but there's really kind of some inner work. And there's some really quick things that need to happen. First of all, just to kind of start you down the path, and companies are at different levels on this, there are easy wins. We kind of need to see that we can cut energy use, save a bunch of money, and there's still so much available. So for years, Japanese companies and GE have done things called treasure hunts, right? It's just an example of asking your employees to go spend a day and find waste. And usually they can find a lot, right? You bring teams together, you go maybe dumpster dive, you look at the waste at the end of the kind of trail, or you'd look at the energy use, and often they'll find like 30%. And so even at small, GE found its own $150 million. It worked with a small company, Exopac, that found 200,000. Now I show this picture of one of those easy wins. This is the simplest thing in the world. As we know, maybe in our own homes, a fan circulates the air. If you put in a really big fan in a distribution center or a factory, it circulates the air and helps reduce the amount of energy that's needed. Do people know the brand of this fan? Anybody know? It's called the Big Ass Fan. That's the brand. That's what they call it, which is why I show it, because I think it's hilarious. But it just moves the air. It's an incredibly cheap thing to do. These are the kinds of quick wins. I have a client that went to one of their factories and asked them to look for energy, and they found 17% savings in a day. 5% was just because there was a transformer, there was a system that was on that didn't need to be. So there's easy wins everywhere. And there's been measurements repeatedly that companies have found that they get better return on investment from carbon reductions than from many other investments. So again, it pays. This is the easy stuff. But let me talk about this return on investment thing. This to me is one of our biggest problems. Whether you call it net present value, return on investment, IRR, whatever. The way we make investment decisions in business is broken because we're very good at measuring the investment, the I. How much cash do we put into something we're choosing to do with our money? But we're not good at measuring R. We just take a look at the return in cash, direct return, and we don't measure all the other value that's created in the business. That's maybe hard to measure, but is value to the business, making the business more resilient, more flexible, attracting and retaining customers and employees, all the things that can build from doing something innovative. And I want to give you a quick example from UPS. So they announced about 5 years ago that they were buying electric vehicles. And the story, the press, was all about how it was the same cost for the truck as a regular truck. And so they could finally make money. They could finally make it profitable to use electric vehicles. And I thought immediately, well, that's wrong, because the cost of running an electric fleet is actually lower. I don't know if anybody knows how many parts there are in a combustion engine. Does anybody know? Throw a guess out. It's 2,000. Okay, it's a lot of parts. How many parts are in an electric engine? 20. It's 99% less detailed, less complex. So the uptime on these vehicles is much higher. The maintenance is much lower. You get much more data out of an electric vehicle. All of these things are benefits. Their entire fleet now operates better. So this vehicle would have been a good investment even when it cost a little more upfront. And this happens across sustainability type investments where we think of it as a cost. It is, again, I always get the question, doesn't it always cost more? And it's a weird question because everything in business costs money. We make a choice to put money into marketing or research and development or people or anything. It's only when we call it sustainability do we somehow assume it's always a loss. It's an investment like anything else. So again, it pays to do this right. So getting these kind of mental models right is critical. But then the work of building a net positive company starts from purpose, from knowing why you're here. Now, I mentioned Unilever. They had a really strong history. When Paul got there, there was a lot to build on. They started in the 1870s. Lifebuoy soap was their first product. And they had a mission at the time. They built this little community for workers, the Lever brothers. Their mission was to make cleanliness commonplace and to lessen work for women. It was kind of a thing of its time. And so when Paul came in, he said, we can build on that and make sustainable living commonplace. That's been the goal. And there's lots of great companies with mission statements and purpose that make sense for their business. Bayer wants to create health, reduce hunger. Schneider Electric, they do buildings, they do technology, so they're going to help people make the most of their resources. Tesla, when they're not buying social media companies, their mission, decarbonize the world, accelerate the transition. And by the way, Tesla's value has gone down. I think he's lost something like 16 months of stock gains. And I think it's partly because if you're an investor in Tesla and you know this is the mission, what does Twitter have to do with that, right? If you go off your mission that far, I think you get punished. And Generale here, biggest company, I think, in Italy, they have this kind of mission statement, this new strategy of being a lifetime partner, starting to think more than just we insure, right? This is the kind of statement you're seeing. The next step is really thinking differently about the goals we set, the boundaries. And what I mean by blowing up boundaries is that you start with yourself, your own business. You might set a goal like we're going to reduce waste. We want to go to zero waste. And that's within your control. But the reason you have a zero waste goal is because you know there's a larger waste problem. The reason to have a zero carbon goal is because there's a larger problem. And so the boundary breaking in your mind comes in part from the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. If you're not familiar with them, please take a look. A UN-produced organizational kind of tool, 17 categories that really describe what a thriving world would look like, where there's no hunger and poverty, where people have opportunities for work, where we've tackled climate, all of these issues, where we work in peace, where we partner. This is a really good business plan for the world, and more companies are using it to think differently about their goals. Enel in Italy has a pretty big goal. They want power for a brighter future. They want to empower sustainable progress, and they've set aggressive goals. Net zero by 2040, 100% green energy. That's a big goal. For a fossil fuel company, to me, this is the only goal that makes sense. Because to have goals that are compatible with life on Earth, we're going to have to move away from fossil fuels. So these companies that have done this, Ørsted is one in Europe that already made this change. They went from being oil and natural gas to being the largest producer of offshore wind. They completely reduced their carbon footprint. But the companies that are pushing into net positive goals are going even further. So Microsoft, for example, they said they want to sequester carbon, take carbon out of the air, equal to all of the carbon they've emitted since they were founded. It's a retroactive carbon neutrality goal. It's aggressive. Google has something similar. These are actual Google facilities. They're one of the largest buyers of renewable energy in the world. Amazon and Google are the two biggest. And they've said they want by 2030 to use only green electrons, only green energy to power their business. Now to do that, you need a lot on site, you need a lot of storage, but then since you will also plug into the grid, you're going to need to change the grid. And that's where systems change comes in. And they talk about this in their business, that they need to work with partners and the grid. You have goals now that are looking out at the impacts in many ways in the business. Walmart, the largest company by revenue in the history of the world, has a goal to be a regenerative company. That's a similar word to net positive. They're close enough. They're similar. And they have said they want to restore 50 million acres of land, save 1 million square miles of ocean. This is part of their way of trying to reduce or make positive their impacts on the natural world. You're seeing more and more goals now on social issues. The goals used to be, I've been following corporate goals for years on this realm. I have a website, pivotgoals.com, that's public. You can look up the goals of the top 200 largest companies. And goals for years on the social side were very vague. We care about equity. But they've really moved in recent years to have numbers. So Woolworths, the retailer, says women will be 40% of our executive team and will equalize pay. And the next level of goals is living wage goals, where you say for the whole value chain, everyone will make a living wage. That's the inner core, the goal setting, the mindset. Then you start to build to the outside. The real work starts to be about partnership. And I'll leave you with a couple quick stories. My favorite story, I think, in the book is really about Apple. So they already are about 100% renewable energy. So they wanted to start to decarbonize their products. And they started to work with and helped fund a joint venture with Alcoa and Rio Tinto to produce aluminum in low carbon or zero carbon ways. And what's fascinating about this is they did it, this small company produces zero carbon aluminum, is that they bought the first batch because they were the first one committed. The second batch was bought by Audi for the wheels of an electric vehicle. So this to me is pure net positive because Apple, as many devices as they have, is not really a huge player in aluminum, right? Aluminum's in buildings and cars and planes, but they are impacting the entire industry. That's net positive. You have partners within sectors with peers on some things that seem very mundane, very, kind of small, but really matter. The Consumer Goods Forum is a group of all the big consumer products companies in the world. They agreed on some standards around pallets. It's the silliest thing, but I learned about pallets in doing this book. There are 10 billion in the world. There's more than one pallet for each of us. And so getting standardized sizes means you can pack trucks tighter, everything's more efficient. It's one of those things that seems not so important but really matters and pays off. It just saves money. You also have companies across sectors that have a shared issue. So a bunch of companies that want more transportation options, they want electric vehicles. They realized that if we go the route of, say, our devices, I see many different computers, how many different plugs do we have in the room? If we did that with electric vehicles or other kind of big technologies, it would be a nightmare. And Tesla did go down that path. They built their own charging network. They were like Apple. I have 3 Apple devices with 3 different plugs. That's ridiculous. So these companies said, let's get together, let's start lobbying for standards. This seems so kind of wonky. It's needed. Standards make the world go round. They said, let's have standards on how things are bought in the electric vehicle world, on the plugs, so everything's the same. So the question is, what are your shared hurdles within your sector, within your value chain? What are the problems that stand in the way? When someone says to me, I think sustainability costs more, I say, well, why does it? If you think that, why? What's the thing costing more? Is it an issue of scale? Is it a problem that can be solved together? Don't just say, it's too much. Let's figure out the problem. And finally, a couple stories from Unilever. Now, I've been making the case this is good for business, obviously, and basically saying this is not philanthropy. It isn't. So this story is going to sound like philanthropy at first, but it isn't. So Lifebuoy soap, the first brand at Unilever, is the brand that has been working with UNICEF. Unilever and UNICEF have the largest NGO corporate partnership, I think, in history. They've been doing these hand-washing campaigns where they help kids and new mothers learn to wash hands because 5 million children die every year from diseases they could avoid if they just wash their hands. So they do these events in India, South America, and other places using Lifebuoy soap. Now, the initial plan was kids are supposed to stand there and wash their hands for 30 seconds. We all went through this at the beginning of the pandemic. But if you've had little kids, getting them to stand still for 30 seconds is not easy. And there's not always enough water. So Unilever the marketing folks asked the R&D team, can you do something about this? And by the way, this brand, this isn't some cause-related marketing thing. These hand-washing things, this is just part of the brand. Everyone on this brand knows they are solving a larger problem. They're helping people wash hands all over the world, but it's part of this health mission. And so they asked R&D, can you help with this? And they came up with a version that killed the germs in 10 seconds. They found some new compounds, and it changes color so the kids know when they're done. They can go, it's green now, I'm done. So this is innovation, and they brought these technologies into other products, and this created growth. This brand had been stagnant, had not grown for 100 years, and it started growing very fast, like 14% a year, which for soap is really fast, right? This is soap. It's not software. It's growing, and this is now a €1 billion brand. This is how you get value from values, from mission. So again, it pays. Innovation, driving revenues, building connections. And finally, the core of this work is about bringing full systems together. One of the toughest problems in the world is palm oil. Palm oil's in so much of what we eat, what we put on our bodies, and it causes huge deforestation. People in Indonesia and Malaysia cut down trees to grow more palm oil. The big companies that buy it, like Unilever, Procter & Gamble, have been working on this for years and failing completely. But in recent years, deforestation rates in Indonesia have dropped every year. That's a huge success. And the reason is that they finally got everyone together. Not just the big buyers and the processors, but the individual farmers, local leaders, the national government, and finally, and NGOs that brought new solutions, better practices, and money. The Norwegian Sovereign Fund and other companies put money in to finance farmers to transition to different species or other ways to grow that were twice as productive. This is the kind of work that gets you to healthy forests and animals and a healthy business world and a healthy community for people. In the end, this is about thriving. Business cannot thrive unless people and planet thrive. So I ask you, how will you be net positive? Please think about this as you go through the next couple days and go home. How will you be net positive in your lives and in your work? And the answer to that question will save the world. Thank you very much.